Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today we're doing our tier list. It's Tuesday, so of course we do tier lists here on the channel. This is going to be my final tier list, my last definitive meta tier list for the Shining Revelry format. This is week number 3, so we do our initial tier list and then our updated tier list, and then, we kind of settle things in, and I think at this point in the metagame, we all understand what the best decks are, and, what decks really, I think, are at the top of the metagame, and which, archetypes you should be playing, especially in tournaments, but also grinding in ranked mode. That's going to be a big aspect of today's video. This is also going to be not only my final tier list, but really my definitive ranked climbing tier list as well. We've got really all of the top decks in the format right now. Some decks from the last couple of weeks are no longer here on the tier list. We kind of filter things out. If they fall into D tier and then below, they just fall off the tier list. So that's what's going on this week. We're going to keep this a little bit shorter, so keep that in mind. Some of the decks that we've talked about in previous weeks are not here anymore, and that's mainly because they just should not see any play in my mind. So that's why this collection of decks might be a little bit smaller, but again, keep in mind, we're really talking about the decks that are prevalent in the metagame currently right now. And here it is, my definitive tier list for the Shining Revelry format. It's been an absolute roller coaster. Things have changed a lot. I don't always do week 3 tier lists, but this week I am going to, because I really think I want to get my final thoughts and really put all of these decks right in their place that I think they're going to stay, of course, for the next week or two until the next set comes out. And at this point, I think we've got just under 2 weeks to hit your ranks here until the rank season ends, and then maybe we get new cards and the next rank season begins. So I'm really excited about that. But let's get right into it, guys. The first deck we're going to talk about today is Articuno 18 Trainer. So Articuno 18 Trainer is, a deck that I think a lot of people were kind of scared of, but also pretty high on early in the format. It saw some play early on, saw some success, but I think a lot of people realized that it really wasn't as good as people thought it was. A lot of the top decks in the format right now are able to set up 2 Pokemon at the same time. Articuno can't really do that. Yes, you can still Misty turn 1, you can Blizzard turn 1, you can go crazy with 18 Trainer Articuno, but overall, I would say its breakpoints are pretty poor. There's a lot of healing in the format with Irida, a lot of high HP Pokemon like Gyarados, and a lot of good water type decks that really aren't 18 Trainer Articuno. At this point, our 18 Trainer Articuno is a deck that you still can climb with, but I think you're going to come and hit a lot of issues, I should say, probably, middle to late Ultra Ball rank. It's going to be pretty hard to reach Master Ball with Articuno 18 Trainer, so we are going to place it right here in B tier. At the end of the video, we're going to try to put all of them in order, but for right now, no order. We're just going to throw them right in their tiers. Next up is Giratina and Darkrai. So here's the thing. We're starting this off real early in the tier list video. I've had Giratina and Darkrai. It started off high A tier to me. It was like the number 2, number 3 deck in the format early on. Early on, we were playing Giratina, and things weren't fully figured out in the format right now. Things like Mewtwo seemed extremely strong, but you know what? We've changed. A lot of the top players have, modified and edited their Giratina and Darkrai decks. I'll put the most recent first place deck here below. And Darkrai now is just a different level. It really is. The main thing I always come back to with Giratina and Darkrai is that it has a perfect combination of 3 unique qualities that I think really make it a top tier deck. The first quality being its consistency. We're playing only 2 different Pokemon in the deck and 2 copies of those Pokemon. The deck is pretty reliant on having both Giratina and Darkrai out early in the game, but with 2 copies of each of those, 2 Pokeballs, 2 Professor's Research, it's pretty likely that we're going to have both a Giratina and a Darkrai in the active spot. Now, because we're not playing Giratina anymore, we have 16 card slots in our deck to be playing trainer cards. That gives the deck a lot of flexibility. That's the number 2 thing about this deck, is that it is incredibly flexible. So it's very consistent, but it's also flexible, allowing us to kind of pick and choose which trainer cards we want to include based off of what the other top decks in the format are. We can play a couple copies of Mars, or maybe, Rocky Helmet, depending on if we're going against Meowscarada and Magnezone, which we've done a lot recently, or if there's a lot of Gyarados, we can play a couple copies of Red, or we can play, things like maybe Dawn to get some early pressure, or, a couple copies of Sabrina, or, more Rocky Helmets, things like that. So we have all of these different abilities basically to change out some of those specific cards in the deck that really increase our flexibility. I think this deck is incredibly flexible and, like I said, very consistent. And then lastly is that it's fairly linear, to be 100% honest with you. I think that this deck is much easier to pilot than things like Mewtwo and Giratina was, especially early on in the format. The mirror match can feel a little bit confusing sometimes, but as long as you understand the breakpoints and you understand kind of your placements when it comes to your, your giant capes or your Rocky Helmets, or, your attachments, which Pokemon you maybe want in the active spot, there's a couple things to keep track of in the mirror match, but for the most part, this deck is very linear. So should be fairly easy to play as far as as decks go. So Giratina Darkrai is going to go into the S tier this week, and I think that it is probably the #1 deck of this format. I feel confident in saying that. It went from high A tier into S tier along with some other decks, but now I think it has cemented itself as really the #1 deck of this format. Some people had that opinion early on, but I don't think it really deserved that spot until really this past week, where it really has showcased its versatility, but also consistency at the top of the format. An incredible deck list here. It has to go into the S tier. Next up is going to be Exeggutor and Meowscarada. So, Meowscarada has, worn a lot of different jackets this format. It's kind of seen play in so many different types of archetypes. In fact, here on the tier list, we have Meowscarada, I believe, 4 or 5 times here. Yeah, we've got 5 different Meowscarada decks. And that really goes to show that Meowscarada is not only a very good card, but a very flexible card. There's a lot of great grass-type cards or even colorless cards in the format, as we've seen things like Arceus and Wigglytuff that pair well with Meowscarada. Exeggutor is a list in my mind that has really fallen off in terms of its viability for a variety of reasons. I think that, Dark Tina honestly doesn't mind Exeggutor much at all. Its breakpoints are a little bit awkward. You're kind of reliant on hitting heads, and for the most part, maybe you're living 2 attacks with Exeggutor, especially with Giant Cape and Erica's, but you're not really living more than 2 attacks. So you got to keep that in mind. And actually, most of the time, we're not living 2 attacks, meaning we're only living 1 attack, I guess I should say. So that's the reason why, Exeggutor really isn't a bad card, but I think in the format right now with other decks that are just so powerful and rampy, like in the mid to late game, that Exeggutor really doesn't do enough damage early on to justify playing it. It's also a stage 2 Pokemon, or not a stage 2 Pokemon, it's a EX Pokemon, which means that it's worth 2 prize cards. So it is always a little bit awkward in the prizing math to play Meowscarada with Exeggutor. Of course, you can go Meowscarada into Exeggutor, but that's not very likely. Exeggutor is most likely going to be our leadoff, which means that once it goes down, our opponent just has to KO Meowscarada once, and then the game is over. So there's a lot of reasons why I think Exeggutor maybe seemed a little bit better early on in the format, but right now, it really just isn't a deck that I would choose to play. I'm kind of debating putting it in the C tier, if I'm being 100% honest with you guys, and I say that all the time, but I'm always honest, and you guys know that here on the channel. Exeggutor, to me, it's really interesting. It's really fallen off. I am actually going to go ahead and put it in the C tier. It was at one point kind of an A tier deck, fringe A, B tier, but I think for right now, C tier is kind of a comfortable spot for Exeggutor and Meowscarada, not something that I would recommend. Now, on the contrary, we have Magnezone and Meowscarada, and this is I think the final form, if so to speak. This is like after Majin Buu absorbs Vegito and Ultimate Gohan, and he just has everything going for him. I might be wrong there in my Dragon Ball chronology, but to be fair, this is as good as it gets for Meowscarada, I think, currently in the format. There's a lot of different ways to play it. We went on a tangent there, but Meowscarada with Magnezone has so many advantages for a variety of different reasons. Realistically, the main upside to this deck is that, yes, it can be a little bit RNG. You got to draw all of your Pokemon. Things can be a little bit awkward with the deck, but for the most part, most of the other decks at the top of the format are pretty slow, right? Things kind of take a little while to get set up. So if we have, 3 or 4 turns to get set up with this deck, then it's pretty likely that we're going to get at least 2, sometimes 3 of these stage 2 Pokemon that all have 140 HP with Giant Cape. They're out of range of even things like Gyarados. So it really just comes down to do you draw the Pokemon or not? I think the deck is fairly simple in its approach, but again, the sequencing of it and some decisions in the early game can really affect your odds of really getting all of these Pokemon. So at first glance, this is a deck that's pretty RNG dependent and a little bit, I guess, maybe easy to understand at first glance, but it actually is a little bit more complex than you would think. And I actually really like this deck, but it's taken over ranked mode, honestly. Now, I have a couple of ideas in terms of how I want this tier list to be, but right now I feel confident in really not putting many decks here in the S tier. For the most part, this is Final Form Meowscarada. This is as good as it's going to get, I think, in this current format right now. Things like Meowscarada Beedrill have fallen off. Things like Exeggutor Meowscarada have fallen off. Wigglytuff had a little bit of time in the spotlight recently, but it's really not a top tier deck. So, Meowscarada and Magnezone has S tier potential, but again, we got to be a little bit choicy as to what decks we're putting into the S tier and if we're going to be putting any other decks in the S tier, right? I really do feel like Giratina and Darkrai has cemented itself as that #1 deck, and I kind of want to, definitively put some separation there. So that's where I'm going to be putting Meowscarada and Magnezone here into the A tier. It's going to be really, really high A tier. It's always hard to say because when decks kind of come up later in the format, you don't know if it's really a phase. But in my playtesting with Meowscarada and Magnezone, and I'm sure a lot of people have played this deck against it as well in Master Ball rank, is that sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But it seems to have a fairly consistent matchup against both Gyarados and Giratina and Darkrai. And I think that's kind of the main reason why it's really kind of found its spot as like that number 3, number 4 deck in the format is because it's really one of those few decks that, you know, is consistent enough and powerful enough, but has a good enough matchup against really the other 2 top decks of the format, which are definitely Gyarados and Giratina Darkrai. So I'm going to put it here in the A tier, and I feel good about that. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but it's got to go in the A tier. It's definitely really, really strong. I talked a lot about it yesterday in our meta report. I think that it deserves that high to A tier spot, but I don't think we have enough time yet with the deck, or we haven't seen enough results, to be fair, to put this or justify putting it here into the S tier. So it's going to go ahead and sit right there in the A tier. The other thing with this deck is that it's not flexible. It is what it is. It's going to be built the same way no matter what the meta looks like. It doesn't have a lot of room to change. So that's the other thing with this deck, is that it's easier to counter because it can't, you know, adjust to how it's playing its list in terms of what it's going to be going up against. So yeah, A tier. Very strong deck, very, very good. Here is Meowscarada and Wigglytuff. So this is last week a deck that saw a little bit of play kind of before the rise of Magnezone Meowscarada. And you know what? I think it's okay. I think, again, you're very reliant on Meowscarada. It's going to have some really good matchups in some scenarios. It is sort of more of a counterplay to Giratina and Darkrai, you know, with the giant capes, with the healing, with the Ericas and stuff like that. Which I believe it runs. But Wigglytuff is an interesting partner to Meowscarada. Technically speaking, you can, you know, put your opponent to sleep early on if you start with Jigglypuff, but for the most part, you definitely want to go into that Sprigatito and start thinning your deck out. So, you know, I like this list. I'm going to put it in the B tier. I think it is better than Exeggutor, simply for the fact that we're not running those, you know, EX Pokemon that don't provide as much value. So at least from the pricing perspective, it's like our opponent has to KO us 3 times. Even if we really only have 2 attacking Pokemon, sometimes Wigglytuff can put in work, but most of the time it's not. It's a very interesting deck, and I think that it's okay, but I don't think it really deserves its A tier slot, at least in this format right now. If you're playing in ranked mode and you really do want to play Meowscarada, I would highly suggest Magnezone. I think it's probably your by far right now in the format your best bet. And next up is going to be Beedrill and Meowscarada, another deck that really has fallen off significantly in play for a variety of different reasons. Again, I think that this is a list that can do really well, but again, for the most part, you're very reliant on getting that Pokemon out early. And like I said, if you lead with Beedrill, or if you're leading with Meowscarada and then you're reliant on that Beedrill as your second Pokemon, yes, Beedrill's got a lot of HP, and yes, you know, you can play Giant Capes, it's got some healing, but again, for the most part, your opponent really only has to KO you twice, and that's kind of the biggest downside. When you're playing something like Meowscarada, you would rather have the ability to go into that third Pokemon than just not, no matter how strong that second Pokemon might be. Beedrill is really strong. If it comes out really early on turn 3, it can kind of win you games sometimes, but, you know, Weedle is kind of a big liability in your deck as well, with only 50 HP. So against things like Carnivine, against things like Skarmory, definitely a little bit terrifying as well. You are susceptible to an early Sabrina. That's the other thing to keep in mind. So you know what? I like Beedrill Meowscarada. It has fallen off here. I think it also kind of deserves to go into the B tier, if I'm being honest with you. It's still like the 6th most played deck of this format, but it didn't have a great showing in the tournament last weekend here, about a 37.5% win rate. So a very bad showing, 45 wins, 75 losses. Honestly, most of the Meowscarada decks I'm not super high on, other than, at least at this point in the format, other than Meowscarada and Magnezone. So those are going to go into the B tier. And then lastly, we have Arceus and Magnezone, and this is sort of another kind of high roll archetype that's playing a lot of Pokemon. So this is really very similar to Arceus and Carnivine, except now instead of playing some of those other like ancillary Pokemon like Rotom, like Shaman or Farfetch'd, things like that, now we're just sort of squeezing that Meowscarada line in here, and this is still a strong deck. Now again, it still falls to the same downsides that the other decks do, where we are playing Arceus EX, which is, you know, worth 2 points, and it is a Pokemon that can get KO'd pretty easily. A little bit awkward with that 140 HP. It's also damage output is a little bit awkward. It's funny to pair Arceus with Meowscarada because they are basically like the same Pokemon in terms of the damage they do and the amount of HP they have, but I think this list is good. Not only do you have the aggressive upside to playing Carnivine in this list, I believe we're playing Carnivine in this list as well, but you also technically, you know, have some scenarios to where you can go maybe Carnivine into Meowscarada, then into Arceus, so it's a little bit better than I think the other Meowscarada archetypes, and I think it probably deserves like a low A tier mention, because I'm also going to be putting Turbo Grass Arceus with Carnivine and not Meowscarada also into the A tier. Again, Arceus isn't bad. I think that right now, the only real true way to be playing Arceus from a viability perspective is going to be actually just be with Carnivine, because I think Carnivine's really well positioned. In fact, I think it's a really good card, whether you're kind of pairing it with Rotom and Sky Support Shaman to give you a little bit more consistency and a little bit more protection against an early Sabrina, or we're just kind of really leaning into Meowscarada and hoping that we draw the cards in the right sequence. Both strategies feel a little bit underwhelming in some scenarios, but can feel extremely strong in other scenarios. Again, it's a deck that really relies capitalize on that early pressure with Carnivine. So, you know, I think both of these decks are good. It's hard for me to say which one is better. They've both had really impressive showings over the last couple of weeks. There are, you know, a plus 50%. They haven't seen a ton of play yet. They're not like the most popular decks in the format, but they always perform fairly well. And again, if we're playing on ranked mode, you got to keep in mind that being able to win games really early is definitely an advantage. And having sort of an auto win scenario against even some decks is really, really good. That 50 damage with Carnivine, you can KO the Manaphy on turn 1 on a Gyarados matchup, or you can just KO Magikarp in the active spot. So there's always upside to that, right? There's always upside to having that really aggressive, fast-paced Pokemon. Things like Carnivine just provide a lot of value. In fact, you know, when we get to Magnezone and Skarmory, we're going to talk about it pretty similarly, where that deck just has the potential to just kind of auto-win matchups if you draw properly. So, you know, I think it's really, really fun, and I think they're really good in ranked mode. I don't think they're anything super substantial. They're probably going to go like mid A tier, again, not in order or anything like that at the moment, but I feel comfortable putting both of these Grass Arceus decks in A tier. And then next up is going to be Giratina and Mewtwo. So here is, you know, my personal favorite deck of this format so far. It was the deck that really carried me through to Master Ball in ranked mode. Early on in this format, things have changed a lot, to be fair. You know, early on, Mewtwo and Giratina felt like really the only option to both beat Giratina and Darkrai and Gyarados. But then what happened was that both Gyarados and Darkrai and Giratina modified their deck lists to really have a better matchup against Mewtwo. Gyarados was running Giant Cape, so we were no longer really able to hit that breakpoint between Rocky Helmet Red hitting with Mewtwo. We couldn't hit for the 180. And now with 200 HP, Gyarados is just unfortunately unable to get KO'd. So it doesn't have the advantage that Giratina and Darkrai does, where you can kind of just attach Giant Capes and then attack turn after turn with both Giratina and Darkrai. Mewtwo kind of struggles with that. Once you attack once, you can't really attack again, even though it does have a lot of HP. It just doesn't feel necessarily as good. And you can't, you know, do 150 into 50 because they play Irida and things like that. So, you know, also like no Druddigon and Giratina Darkrai kind of made that matchup a lot more favorable, to be fair, for Giratina Darkrai. But Mewtwo and Giratina is still a really good deck, and I think it still deserves a mention, right? It struggled a little bit, again, because its matchups against the other two top decks of the format are not as good. But again, you know, if I think as time goes on, those top two decks are probably going to be countering more so Magnezone and Meowscarada than they will be Mewtwo. So I think there's a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors formulation going on at the top of the metagame. But what that typically does is that since all of those decks are focused around each other, then things like, you know, the fourth or fifth most played decks, things like Mewtwo and Giratina, or maybe something like, you know, one of the fighting decks can kind of slide in and be really well positioned. So, you know, I still think Mewtwo and Giratina is really good. We're going to go ahead and put it high A tier. It'll probably be third or fourth on my tier list. Very, very good deck, but, you know, it's no longer an S tier deck. I think it has kind of fallen off from that point. It was in S tier my first 2 weeks, and I think it deserved to be, but at this point, I don't think really any other decks deserve to be S tier, honestly, other than Giratina Darkrai. I think it really has cemented itself as that #1 spot on our tier list here. Okay, so now we're gonna move through some of these decks that maybe aren't something to talk about too much. One of them is going to be Charizard. Charizard remains one of the top 5, top 6 most played decks, and you know, I always love playing Charizard. I think Charizard is a better deck to be playing in ranked mode, especially like in Master Ball rank, than it is like in tournament settings. I think there's a lot of weird decks that aren't necessarily top tier meta decks that Charizard just struggles against. Some of those aggro decks are certainly one of them, but there's a lot of like weird niche like fighting decks and water decks that people play in the format or in tournaments that aren't necessarily something you oftentimes see in Master Ball rank. When you're in Master Ball rank, you really just go up against like Giratina Darkrai, you know, Gyarados, sometimes Mewtwo, and then mostly Meowscarada and Magnezone. So those are like the decks that you see. So when you're playing Charizard, you actually have like a decent matchup against all of those decks because they're fairly slow. So in ranked mode, I actually think Charizard's a pretty good pick. I would put it like also in A tier, like mid-bottom A tier. I think it's really good. In fact, there's plenty of players who have just sort of high-rolled their way into you know, getting into Master Ball rank with Charizard. And you know what? It is what it is. The upside to Charizard is that it's very difficult to misplay with the deck, very easy to understand. And of course, when I play against Charizard, they always have Moltres as their starting Pokemon, and then they always get turn 3 Charizard. So, of course, you know, if you draw all the right cards, then you just win. Of course, now, Giratina Darkrai is running more copies of Mars more often. In fact, more decks are running Mars, which definitely can affect sort of the flow of Charizard and Moltres. So that maybe knocks it down a peg, but for the most part, Charizard is still a very respectable deck list to be respected here at the top of the format. It's got to go here somewhere in A tier. Next up are the Rampardos decks. Let's do them both here together. So Lucario and Rampardos is a deck that I had a little bit lower for a while, to be 100% honest. But the thing with Lucario and Rampardos is that you have a little bit more aggression and you can be a little bit more front-loaded. Whereas when you're playing Hitmonlee, yes, of course, we have really strong matchups into things like Gyarados, being able to KO those Magikarps, but now they're playing, you know, Giant Capes, so like that sometimes doesn't feel as good. But also, like when you're going up against a Darkrai or Giratina, like they don't have to bench anything. So we are very reliant when we're playing Hitmonlee to be finding Rampardos early on, or maybe Marshadow early on, whereas Lucario isn't as necessarily reliant on that, because Lucario can attack, it can be aggressive. We also have things like Sudowoodo or any other sort of lead-off Pokemon that we might be using. So I actually really like both Rampardos decks still in the format. It performed really decently in this last tournament. It had a 53% win rate. Rampardos to me is still an A-tier deck. Both of them, in fact, in my mind, are both A-tier. It's hard for me to really justify like where I want to put either of them on like the specific tier, because I think that there's a lot of A-tier decks in the format right now. But, you know, 100%, like I think that they are very respectable. They've fallen off in play a lot, if we're being honest. But, you know, I guarantee you, if you play these decks, if you're good at playing these decks and you understand them and you play them in ranked mode, like you'll probably win a decent amount of games, like if I'm being entirely serious with you, because against the top decks of the format, Rampardos just does fairly well, whether that's Lucario and Hitmonlee. It really kind of depends on what the format looks like right now. I kind of am favoring Lucario right now more than I am Hitmonlee, but I think they're both very, very respectable. They're decks that have beat me plenty of times in Master Ball rank, and I think that they always do fairly well in tournament. For whatever the reason, fighting really fell off, I think, in favor of things like Meowscarada. But for the most part, I like both Rampardos here. I'm going to put Hitmonlee behind Charizard, but I think they both actually kind of deserve to be in S tier. Actually, you know what? I kind of want to take that back a little bit, because Hitmonlee is decent, but the thing is, like when you're going against Magnezone and Meowscarada, like that Hitmonlee damage really doesn't matter that much, because they're probably just going to find their stage 1 evolutions like pretty early on, right? Like, so I might actually just put it in B tier, because I don't love the Hitmonlee matchup against Meowscarada and Magnezone, because they have so many Pokemon in their deck that like you might be able to like whittle down and take a KO on a bench Magnezone, but like for the most part, like you're not able to even KO Meowscarada with Rampardos, right? So that's kind of a downside. This deck runs red, so you know it's a little bit awkward. I actually am going to put Hitmonlee here in the B tier with Rampardos, but Lucario Rampardos I think is still probably like a mid to low A tier deck, and I feel pretty strongly about that, and I think that's kind of where I'm going to keep them. Because again, I'm thinking about like the overall aspect. Like I need to keep in mind that this is like the final tier list that we're doing, right? And I'm recommending these decks for the next couple of weeks for the next week's tournament, but also the next, you know, 10, 12 days of ranked mode. I really have to kind of lock in and let people know what I think is probably the best choice. Like, and that's how I'm looking at this. So Rampardos Hitmonlee, I think is probably on the, it's going downward. Whereas I think Rampardos and Lucario is kind of on the upward trend. So that's where they're going to go. I think Rampardos is definitely really, really good with Hitmonlee, but probably B tier, at least at the moment. So yeah, okay. Next up is going to be Magnezone and Skarmory. And here's the thing. You know, I spent so much time, like the first 2 weeks, every day, I was like, you know, Magnezone has fallen off. It's not a great card to be playing right now in the format. It doesn't make sense to play it, but Magnezone has one upside, and that is it is incredibly flexible. And Magnezone right now is really the card that you always want to throw into other archetypes that are playing other non-EX Pokemon, because it can just fit with anything, and it's also a fairly decent, you know, Pokemon that you don't ever really have to attach energies to, which is also a really big upside. So that's why we see that Magnezone pairs really well with things like Meowscarada and like Skarmory, which otherwise are just really strong non-EX Pokemon that just fit well with Magnezone. So whether you wanted to play more of a late game kind of, sort of a mid-range setup and sweep, you know, version of Magnezone with Meowscarada, or you wanted to play just a really fast-paced, aggressive version of Magnezone, then you can play Skarmory. So you really have both options. And what's funny to me is that somehow both of these decks have found their way really significantly in the metagame. This deck actually, like if we're just gonna go ahead and just, you know, go with just raw data, last weekend of the Ursa Days tournament, Magnezone and Skarmory had the highest win rate. It literally was like the most winning deck from a percentage standpoint. And in ranked mode, this is a deck that for me never works out, but when I go up against it, it's super annoying because like Skarmory with Rocky Helmet, 50 damage, they're going second every turn. Like it just feels really tough to keep up with it. Now the deck is very reliant on drawing into your Magnezones, because we don't really have any way to thin the deck like we do when we're playing the Meowscarada line. And yes, we're playing Pokeballs and researches, but if you don't draw your Magnezones, then the deck really cannot ever win, right? Like you're not going to win the game with just 2 Skarmories. So without Magnezone, we're kind of like not winning the game, and it can feel bad if we don't draw it. But, you know, it is a deck that that honestly is very well positioned, I think. With all of the Gyaradoses running around, even like things like Giratina Darkrai, really fast, it's the really slower decks. Magnezone and Meowscarada, another slow deck, so being able to be really aggressive and take one-hit KOs on a lot of Pokemon is really, really relevant. So we're going to go ahead and also put this into the A tier. In fact, I'm going to actually put it like right behind Mewtwo and Giratina. Again, not everything is in perfect order right now, but we're actually kind of putting things in order somewhat at the moment. But anyway, Magnezone and Skarmory definitely a lot better right now than I thought it ever would be. Just a really good deck, and I think if we're playing in ranked mode right now, again, pace is something you always got to keep in mind. When you're playing Magnezone and Skarmory, like sometimes you win games on turn 2, turn 1, turn 3, turn 4. You just typically win a little bit quicker when you're playing this deck, and that's definitely an upside if you're looking to grind ranked battles. So pace is always something to consider when you're kind of thinking about what decks to play in ranked mode, but it's a deck that honestly matches up pretty well against the other top decks of the format, and I think that it really punishes decks that just don't draw the right cards early enough, especially against things like Meowscarada and Magnezone. So yeah, it's gotta go A tier to me. Honestly, it's really, really good. It's a really, really good deck right now. Okay, so next up is going to be Magnezone and Darkrai. So, you know, here's the thing with Magnezone Darkrai is that it's not that good. It's a deck, I think, sort of a relic from an older time. You know, I think a lot of people realize that, you know, Darkrai and Magnezone do go well together, but there's just better partners for both of these Pokemon. And it kind of is this weird sort of, like, failed marriage in a sense where, like, you know, at one point in time when we didn't have Meowscarada and we didn't have Giratina, like these two Pokemon went together really well, and it was sort of the best option for both of them. At this point, it's sort of not the best option for either of them. With Meowscarada, or with Magnezone, I should say, we probably want to play it with Meowscarada or Skarmory, and if we're Darkrai, we probably want to play with things like Greninja or Giratina, and I think that that's really where this deck kind of falls right now, and unfortunately, it's just not a deck that I would really recommend to any capacity, really, for any player playing in tournament or in ranked mode. This is a deck here that's falling down into the C tier for me. Not a terrible deck, but just a deck that really doesn't hang with like any of the other decks that, you know, you probably should be consider playing other than that. You know, it's tough. It really is. Like turn 3 like Magnezone can be really good, but also like, you know, at the same time, it's not enough. It doesn't do enough is what I'm saying in the format right now. Okay, next up we have, what is this? We have Pikachu and Magnezone, yeah. So Pikachu Magnezone is, it's certainly an interesting one. This is a deck that still continues to see some sort of play, very little play at this point. I know some people are really high on it. Some people love playing this new Pikachu. And here's the thing, Pikachu EX, the new one, has a lot of potential. And again, you know, when we're playing Magnezone, it just feels awkward to play it with a Pokemon that's not Skarmory and not Magnezone or Meowscarada. So the thing with Pikachu, for again, in a lot of different ways, is that even with Giant Cape, we're at 140, but if we don't have Giant Cape, we're really susceptible to Sabrina. I think one of the, really the only upside to Pikachu right now is that we can do 150 on turn 3. And that's really, really good. With Dawn, with Magnezone, we can do that on turn 2. That's very, very good. But a lot of Pokemon right now with Giant Cape are above that 150 threshold, so not only are, after we attack, we're discarding all of the energies, we're gonna get KO'd probably immediately anyway. So if you're facing down a Pikachu EX in the active spot, you can just say, listen, you know what? I'm just going to start, you know, setting up my Pokemon on my bench, right? I'm just going to go ahead and set up my bench Giratina instead of my active. And listen, you can KO that active Giratina, but then I'm going to KO you, and you don't really have a lot to do after that. And that's really the big downside to Pikachu. Pikachu is a really good card. It's just missing a little bit of support, whether that's sort of a second partner Pokemon as to act sort of as a buffer between Magnezone and Pikachu, or maybe just some supporter cards that allow the deck to be a little bit more explosive. That could also kind of put it back into the spotlight. But for right now, Pikachu Magnezone is also a C tier deck. It could honestly be in the D tier. It really actually could. I'm going to be a little bit generous this week, and I'm actually going to put it in the C tier because I want to be a little bit selective. We got to be somewhat realistic. Pikachu can still win games. It's not a terrible deck, but not something that I would really consider playing personally. Again, very similar to, you know, Magnezone and Darkrai. Magnezone is a pretty decent card, as we've seen, but we kind of have to pair it right now, at least in the format, with other non-EX Pokemon. Okay, so next up is Darkrai and Greninja. So Darkrai Greninja's changed a bit as well as the format has gone on. I think the list that we're probably going to showcase here is with Giratina. So there was actually a third place deck from the Ursa Days tournament that was playing, you know, 2 Darkrai, 2 Giratina, 2 Druddigon, and then the full Greninja line. It was playing like 12 Pokemon, and Limitless categorized that as Darkrai and Giratina because it was playing 2 copies of both. But for the most part, I think that Darkrai and Greninja is another deck that's really, really strong into the late game. A little bit awkward if you don't draw your Pokemon, but again, the games right now are so slow. It's kind of hard to, really kind of count that as a big downside. There are some aggressive decks in the format, but, with Nightmare Aura, with, the damage output that we're doing with Druddigon's Rough Skin, plus the attack from Giratina that can do 130, plus Water Shuriken Greninja. There's just a lot of damage. So in the late game, this is a deck that can kind of just hang with really any deck. But again, you got to get all your Pokemon set up. So if you don't get the Giratina or the Darkrai out early, if you don't lead with Druddigon, things can just sort of fall apart a little bit, and it can feel a little bit awkward. So you kind of have to put the pieces together. It's different. Like, we're running the same amount of Pokemon as Meowscarada and Magnezone, but it's a lot different in the sense that when you're playing Meowscarada and Magnezone, even though we're still playing 12 Pokemon, you have a 50-50 chance to lead with Sprigatito, and then you can thin your deck with that attack. So it's a little bit different. It's definitely a bit different, but the deck definitely has a lot of routes, especially in the mid to late game if you can get there. But I think it's a totally fine deck. We're going to go ahead and put it in the B tier. I don't know if I really love it in the A tier right now. I know it did just get 3rd place at the tournament, but I think for the most part, if we're playing this archetype, we are a little bit RNG dependent, and I think that there's other RNG dependent decks that are just better than it in the format right now. So it's going to go ahead and go like high B tier. We could maybe justify low A tier, but I want to be a little bit selective here, and I think that Darkrai and Greninja is really good. But again, if we're playing Darkrai Greninja, we're probably like the best way to play it is just to play it with Giratinas, right? So now you're just kind of turning your Giratina and Darkrai deck into more of like a high roll late game deck, which, sacrifices not only all of your flexibility, but a lot of your consistency for that late game power. It's just not something that I would really recommend above just playing like the traditional Giratina Darkrai. So that's where that's at. Okay, Dialga and Gholdengo. So here's the thing, I was gonna take this off the tier list. I was removing all of the decks that just really weren't like worth mentioning from the tier list last week, but then I thought to myself, you know what, guys, we need at least one deck here in the D tier. We need one D tier representation. The D tier is right here. It's not going anywhere, and we need at least one deck to put into it, and that's where Dialga and Gholdengo is going. This somehow is a deck that people continue to play. I don't know exactly why. I can't describe it to you. I can't tell you why this deck sees play. I know some people just maybe like playing it, but Dialga is not a good card. I've been saying it since day one, since the format came out. And realistically, it's not done anything. It's done nothing but really lose most of games in this new format, and I think nothing is any different with Gholdengo. Just not a good deck. And again, it's sort of our perfect D tier representation because people continue to play it and they continue to lose with it. You know what? And that's fine. I'm not saying I'm not shaming anybody that plays this list, but if you're trying to get to Master Ball rank, this is like your D tier deck. This is like the worst. This would be the hardest deck to play in the metagame right now to hit Master Ball in my mind, other than like things that aren't real decks. You know what I mean? So there it is. Gonna go into the D tier. RIP to this deck. I apologize to everybody that really likes this deck list, but I just can't put it anywhere other than D tier, and that's my mind. Okay. So we've got Darkrai and Weavile. So Darkrai Weavile is, an interesting deck. I think it was a lot more well-positioned early on in the format. And I don't think it's a terrible deck anymore. I had this A tier, like consistently A tier, but since Mewtwo has really fallen off, like my first impression of the format was that Mewtwo might really kind of overtake Darkrai, but then it went the other direction, and now Giratina Darkrai, a little bit more consistent, a little bit more flexible. Gyarados is playing giant capes, like there's a lot of stuff going on. Meowscarada Magnezone's flying around. Meowscarada becomes even more popular. And then all of a sudden, Darkrai and Weavile just becomes a deck that just doesn't feel nearly as good to play as most of the other decks. So, I do feel a little bit bad about this deck list because I thought it had a lot of potential, and it really was a deck that I felt was well positioned early on in the format. But at this point, it's really not. This is going to go like B tier. I'm going to put it right below Greninja. It's not a terrible deck. You could make it to Master Ball playing this deck list, but it's really not something that I think is a great choice. Like, this is like, to me, like the epitome of B tier right now, as we've kind of approached week 3 of the format. So for that reason, there it is. It's got to go right there into the B tier, and it's going to sit there probably pretty comfortably. Again, I do feel a little bit bad about it. If we lived in like a different reality and the timeline went differently, this deck could have been really relevant. But I think Weavile always is a little bit behind in terms of its strength. You know what I mean? Like, it's good, but it's like it always feels like it's just not good enough, especially when you look at all of the other Darkrai decks and what they're able to do. Okay, let's knock out the other 2 Dialga decks, which are going to be Arceus and Dialga, and like Arceus and Dialga with Giratina. Neither of these decks to me are good, if I'm being if I'm being in general pretty serious. I do think that it's better than Gholdengo. Like, Arceus is still a decent card. This is not a deck I think you should be playing. This is definitely going to go here into the C tier, and I'm going to put it like high C tier if I can. I'm going to put it at the top of C tier. It's a good deck. It's just not a well-positioned deck, and I don't think it can keep up with really of the other decks in the format. And you got to kind of look at it like this, right? Like, if you look at the top decks of our format, they really are able to set up like 2 really strong Pokemon at the same time, whether that's Mewtwo Giratina, Darkrai Giratina, or even Gyarados, right? With Manaphy setting up both, 2 Gyaradoses or Origin Form Palkia and Gyarados. So they're able to set up 2 really effective Pokemon at the same time. And Dialga and Arceus can't really do that. You're kind of setting up Dialga, and then, you're setting up Arceus with Dialga, but Dialga isn't a really useful Pokemon. It's really not. It's got a lot of HP, it can tank hits, but it can do a little bit of damage, but it's not something that's really going to win you games in the late game or in the mid game. It's just not a useful card in that sense. You can hit for 100 damage, but it's not something that's really providing you value. So you are very reliant on Arceus, but again, with red, a lot of the breakpoints just don't really work out well for Arceus, and unfortunately, it also kind of falls behind. So I think in the future, Dialga does have potential, right? If we had like a metal-type Gyarados card or something that was similar to that, Dialga could be relevant, right? But I think for right now, there's not another, yet again, there's just not a good enough partner to justify playing Dialga. And the metal type really has fallen back behind it. We, again, need another revamp of the steel type or metal type in the game, which is definitely a bit unfortunate. But yeah, it's going to go here into the C tier. And then lastly, with Giratina, it's funny to me, like, if I just put this deck higher on the tier list because it runs Giratina, then, like, what does that say about, like, the format or about this particular deck? Like, yes, I want to say that Giratina does make the deck better because Giratina is a better card, and of course, when you fit it into this deck list, it's better. But I don't think that it's like B tier better. I think it's also just C tier. And, some people might disagree with that, and this is a list that, again, if you go way back, like in week 1, the consensus was that this was like the new deck. Like, people were playing it, people were talking about it, and it just wasn't. It really wasn't. And I kind of did see that early on, and I tried to sort of tell people that it wasn't something that I thought would end up being really good. And as time goes on, it's basically just completely fallen out of the meta. In fact, really all of these decks here in C and D tier are decks that you really probably just shouldn't play, because there's a lot of really better decks other than them. And again, Dialga and Arceus is, as a core archetype, just not very good in the format. And if you're playing Giratina with it, yes, you have some other advantages, but for the most part, you're just playing a mixed match of decks that just really don't go together really well. And again, we can't Metallic Turbo and Broken Space Bellow in the same turn. So, like, realistically, what is Giratina actually doing other than like wasting a turn for you at some point, or just being the only Pokemon that you use? So yeah, keep that in mind. Okay. Next up, we have Palkia. And this is, I just have Palkia as an image, same with Gyarados, because there are a couple of ways that people are playing these decks. Palkia is mainly actually played with Origin Form, Palkia, and Manaphy. It's like sort of the other, awkward, like, little brother of Gyarados, but in fact, in a lot of ways, I think it is actually better than Gyarados. The thing with Gyarados here is that it always struggles with consistency issues. So for players that want to play these sort of, high roller kind of setup and sweep water type decks, Palkia is actually a really good option for you because it's much more flexible than Gyarados. It's a basic Pokemon, 150 HP. You can still hit 150 with it, but you can slash for 30. It's a lot more consistent. You can pull it off Pokeball, and I actually really like Palkia with Origin Form Palkia and Manaphy. In fact, I think it's also a really, really top tier deck in the format. It's just a deck that people don't really end up playing. But for like the second week in a row, this is a deck that actually placed really well on the final standings. So you know what? I really like Palkia. I'm going to go ahead and put it here into I'm going to go ahead and put it into A tier. I'm going to put it like right here, like middle A tier. I think it's good. I just hasn't seen enough play for me to really justify it. But I just know that after playing this list and seeing it do well in tournaments, I just know that it's basically like a little bit less strong version of Gyarados that is definitely a lot more consistent in the early game, which gives it a lot more potential. Also, early Misty is a little bit more volatile and impactful when you're playing Palkia than you are playing Gyarados. And that's just the way it goes. So yeah, if you want to sacrifice some of your overall strength for a little bit more consistency, I think Palkia is a really good alternative to Gyarados, even though you might not win as many games against the top decks of the format, but it is still definitely a really, really good deck. So it's got to go in the middle A tier for me. I genuinely, I do believe that. Okay, so here's the fun one. You know, this is sort of our resident, like, not meme deck. It's like the meme deck that broke through and became like a real deck in the format, and that is Giratina and Dragonite. So I think at this point, this is probably the best Dragonite has ever been. Again, for a variety of different reasons. I think that Dragonite is a totally fine card, just an absolute, like, interesting card in the format that's not terrible. You know, it hasn't seen enough play for me to really justify saying it's like meta, but it's seen enough play for me and enough success for me to like put it on the tier list and to give it like some real thought. And playing against this deck, like especially against like Meowscarada and Magnezone, like I feel like I lose to Dragonite. I just feel like Dragonite isn't a bad card. It's just slow, but again, a lot of the top decks in the format are slow. So would we rather take our time to set up a really strong Pokemon that can just attack once, or one Pokemon over and over again and just take big KOs? Or do we want to play Dragonite, maybe roll the dice a little bit, but maybe just take multiple KOs after attacking a couple times with Dragonite, and then maybe finishing off the game with Giratina? So, you know, I really do like Dragonite. And, you know, I have to go out on a limb here and say that Dragonite isn't bad. Honestly, I cannot put this deck here in the A tier. I just can't. Maybe it is like fringe A tier, but I just can't. We're gonna put it here in the B tier, and I'm gonna put it like right here, middle B tier, maybe like high B tier. Maybe we just give it the credit for getting, you know what, we'll put it mid B tier. It's a good deck, it really is. Like, you can hit Master Ball with this list. You're gonna struggle some ways, you're gonna hit a lot of RNG, but sometimes you're gonna steamroll your opponent. It's very respectable. Dragonite also has 160 HP, so that is a very tough cookie to crack there. It's got a lot of HP. Of course, it's a stage 2 Pokemon, so you gotta find your evolutions. But if you do, you get the energies, right, it's also a dual energy deck. There's a lot of obstacles in the way for Dragonite, but if you do knock down those obstacles, you're probably gonna have a pretty decent chance of winning the game. So shout out to Dragonite, a very respectable deck here. Next is Wugtrio. So I know a lot of, like, Wugtrio is, again, also like that other meme deck that, you know, and it's similar to Dragonite in that sense. It's really just sort of an RNG fest. But, you know, the upside with Wugtrio is that sometimes, you know, you get Misty off and then you turn to Wugtrio and you start just blasting for 150. 150 for 3 energies is crazy on a stage 1 Pokemon, even if that damage is spread out. So, you know, I got to give a lot of respect to Wugtrio. In fact, I'm going to put it like right here, also middle B tier. In some ways, it's honestly better than 18 Trader Articuno. I actually believe that. You can play it with Origin Form, or not, maybe, you can play it with Palkia, you can play it with Manaphy, you can play it 16 Trainer. You can play it a lot of different ways, and in fact, I think that Wugtrio is a totally fine card. And it really is. Like, unfortunately though, like you can't just lose games based off of, like, you know, the damage placement and the luck involved with that, but sometimes you just win games because of it. So very similar to Dragonite, and I think that they actually, let's just put them right next to each other on the tier list. How about that? And I'm gonna put Rampardos above them, like right there. And I like this. I do. In fact, I think this is a pretty good placement for both of these decks. You could, like I said, you can make it into Master Ball with Wugtrio and Dragonite. It's just gonna be pretty difficult to do so. So it's not something I would necessarily recommend. But if you wanted to play something that's off meta but still has the potential to just win fairly often, this is a list that I would kind of recommend for you. So yeah, there's Wugtrio. And then lastly, we've got Gyarados. And, you know, Gyarados, man, you know, last week I was a bit scared. I did put Gyarados in the S tier last week, along with Giratina Darkrai and along with Mewtwo. And I was a little bit scared that Gyarados might just take over the format. But the thing is with Gyarados is that RNG, it's so funny to me, in fact. Gyarados has unlimited potential, but it is limited by its own inability to do what it wants to do consistently. And consistency is always going to be the downside to Gyarados. Also, Hitmonlee still exists. Skarmory has risen actually as, you know, a very prominent card in the format as well. Carnivine's still running around, so those aggro decks definitely put a lot of pressure on you. And yeah, I think that Gyarados is still Gyarados. I can't tell you how many times I've seen my opponent flip heads on Misties 2-3 times, turn 2, go into Gyarados, and then they just steamroll me. And there's nothing I can do because I can't 2-hit KO Gyarados before it can just 2-hit KO me. And then the game's over. And that's really something that feels bad with Gyarados, but also, like, it has that Charizard effect where you just know. You know that no matter what, on turn 3 or turn 4, that Gyarados is coming. And there's probably going to be an Origin Form Palkia as well. So if we're not drawing properly and our opponent's drawing even average, it's going to be tough. It really is. But, you know, with Giant Capes, with the extra damage, with Rocky Helmets, like, there are ways to get over Gyarados. And I think that because it isn't necessarily super strong against the other top decks in the format, even though the matchups might be somewhat favorable for Gyarados, I don't believe that it is an S tier deck anymore. In fact, I feel very strongly about Gyarados as I do the other top decks of the format, which are Meowscarada Magnezone and Giratina Mewtwo. These are decks that are all extremely good. In fact, really all of these decks in A tier to me can win you games and can be very respectable. But if we're really looking to play the best deck of the format, and if we're looking to pick one deck that I think stands above all others, it really has to be Darkrai and Giratina at this point in the format, even above Gyarados and Meowscarada Magnezone. That's how I feel. I just, yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about Gyarados. I think we all know what it is. Maybe it is going to still be a great choice to go into Master Ball rank, and maybe it's the best choice. Who knows? We don't really have all of the ranked mode meta data, but what we do have is the tournament meta, and I think Gyarados definitely belongs like right here at the top of A tier, which is yeah, I mean, it's kind of what we expected, to be honest. Okay, so lastly is Gallade. And Gallade's another interesting one. It's really fallen off. I think that the improvements to a lot of the Giratina decks, and Giratina by far being the most common card in the format, really does get Gallade in a bad way. It makes Gallade feel just not super well aligned in the format. And Gallade had a lot going for it. It really did, but I just think that the format, again, just didn't pan out in a way that was super friendly to Gallade. And that was a big reason. We saw that coming like a week or two ago, and that was why I felt a little bit scared about Gyarados, because I was like, listen, if Gallade falls off, I mean, is Gyarados going to take over? But fortunately, some other things at the top of the format have happened that have kept Gyarados in line, and I think for the most part, Gallade has pretty much fallen out of A tier. It was A tier the last 2 weeks, but at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put it like high B tier here. It's still a very respectable deck, very, very good deck. You can get Master Ball with it, especially if you're good at playing it, but there's just a lot of scenarios that don't feel good enough when you're playing Gallade, and I think that more often than not, especially at the higher ranks, you're going to be at a disadvantage if you're playing Gallade. So keep that in mind, but may you hit all of your Gyaradoses on the way to Master Ball rank, and, you know, bless you on that. So there it is, guys. There is our last tier list, our definitive final tier list for Shining Revelry. Let me zoom out so you guys can get the full thing here. And, you know, let me know what you guys think. You know, what decks have you been doing really well with in Master Ball rank? You know, what decks do you like to play the most? How would you change this tier list? You know, what do you think is different? I think at this point, like I said, Giratina Darkrai really is at the top of the format. It's got its consistency, it's got its power, it's got its, you know, linear, easier to play style, but also it has its flexibility in how we build the deck list, gives us a lot of advantages from week to week as the meta shifts. So I think that's a big reason why I have it S tier and nothing else. But also things like Gyarados, you know, Magnezone and Meowscarada, Mewtwo Giratina, Magnezone Skarmory, the Arceus, you know, aggro grass decks, even things like Palkia, Rampardos, Charizard. All really strong decks that you can definitely get into Master Ball rank with, and I would recommend them for people that just don't want to play, you know, the same kind of meta deck that everybody else is playing, even though you probably will be at an advantage. And then B tier, these are good decks. You know, these are decks that, again, you can make it to Master Ball rank in, but you're definitely going to have a pretty significantly tough time once you get into Ultra Ball. So keep that in mind. I like all of these lists. I wish they were a bit better, but I think from a more of a positioning perspective, they just maybe aren't as good as, you know, those decks here in A tier. C tier, these are decks that you should not play. Technically speaking, if you want to, you know, take the masochist route and try to grind a Master Ball with some of these decks, then good luck, but you're definitely going to struggle, very, very much so. You're probably going to play like 500 to 1,000 games to get into Master Ball with these decks, so good luck there. And then here is Dialga and Gholdengo in the D tier. Do not play this deck. So there it is, guys. That's the tier list. That's my final meta tier list of Shining Revelry, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, we're probably just a week or two away from getting at least an announcement of the next set. Ranked mode, I think then the season ends in about 12 days or so. 12, 13 days. So hopefully this tier list helps you guys, and hopefully, you know, the last 3 weeks were interesting to you guys and helpful. And, you know, again, the meta's changed a lot, and I really do enjoy keeping up with it. So it's been pretty fun for me, but again, you know, I just like to ramble about Pokemon cards. It's really fun for me. So anyway, guys, yeah, that's going to be the tier list. Comment below. Let me know what you guys think. And yeah, that's it. I don't have anything else to say. I don't know. And I don't know how to end videos ever either. So yeah. There it is. Bye. See ya. Bye.